somewhere around 1857. A supply team is 3 weeks into a crossing of the Western Australian interior. 2 of their horses are dead. The third one won't make it to morning. The temperature hasn't dropped below 40 degrees in 11 days, and the nearest water source, if the hand-drawn map they're carrying is even accurate, is still 4 days away. The expedition leader looks at his remaining animals. The horses are finished. The oxen are struggling. But the donkeys? The donkeys are fine. Standing there, in the middle of a landscape that is actively trying to kill everything in it, ears forward, eyes calm, waiting for someone to load them up and keep moving. That image tells you everything about why the donkey became one of the most important animals in Australian colonial history. And it tells you absolutely nothing about the catastrophe that was quietly building with every single one of those footsteps. Because what Australia imported to survive its desert ended up threatening the very desert it was meant to conquer. And the chain of events that followed is one of the strangest, most complicated, and most quietly disturbing ecological stories on the planet. If you're new here, this channel digs into the stories that history books leave out. Hit subscribe and join us, because this one goes deep. To understand the full weight of what happened, you need to go back to a world before highways, before trucks, before any of the infrastructure that makes modern Australia function. It's the early 1820s. Britain has been building its colonial presence in Australia for barely 3 decades. The coastal cities, Sydney, Hobart, are beginning to take shape. But beyond the Great Dividing Range, the interior of the continent stretches out like another planet entirely, dry, hostile, enormous, and completely uncharted by European boots. Settlers pushing inland ran into problems almost immediately. Horses struggled in the heat. Oxen needed more water than the desert ever offered. Feed was unreliable. Animals were dying faster than they could be replaced. The heat alone will kill a horse in a week out there, one account from the period described. But the donkey just keeps walking. And so, the donkey was brought in. The first recorded imports came through ports in South Africa and India, animals already bred for harsh, arid conditions. By the 1840s, the demand had grown significantly, fueled by one explosive event, the Australian Gold Rush of 1851. Overnight, inland Australia transformed. Gold towns like Ballarat, Bendigo and Kalgoorlie erupted from nothing. Thousands of miners pushed further and further into the desert, looking for the next big strike. They needed supplies hauled. They needed water barrels moved. They needed heavy loads carried across terrain that would destroy a wheeled cart in a single afternoon. The donkey was the answer to every single one of those problems. By the 1860s, teams of donkeys, sometimes 30 or 40 animals working in a single train, were a common sight on the tracks between remote outposts. They hauled timber to mine shafts. They carried food to stations weeks away from the nearest market. They transported sick miners back to hospitals in coastal towns. Pastoralists quickly noticed something else too. Unlike cattle or sheep, donkeys could be turned loose in the scrub at the end of a season and survive without any human management whatsoever. No feed cost, no housing, no staff to watch them overnight. That decision, casual, economical, and completely understandable, planted the seed for everything that followed. But here's the question nobody was asking at the time. What happens when an animal designed to survive without human help is released into a landscape that has no natural predators large enough to stop it? The answer didn't come immediately. It crept up slowly, across decades, like a tide nobody noticed until it was already at the door. Through the second half of the 1800s, the donkey population in Australia's interior was quietly, steadily growing. Some animals escaped on their own, gaps in fencing, broken tethers, a moment of distraction. Others were deliberately released when goldfields closed and miners walked away with empty pockets, leaving the animals behind. When the railway lines began expanding across the continent in the 1870s and 1880s, whole teams of working donkeys became redundant almost overnight. No point feeding an animal you don't need, was the logic, so they were turned loose. By the early 1900s, reports were coming in from station owners in Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Wild donkeys, not one or two strays, but herds, moving across the desert. The donkey, it turned out, was extraordinarily well suited to go feral in Australia. Here's why that matters biologically. Donkeys are descended from the African wild ass, Equus africanus asinus, a species that evolved over millions of years in the deserts of the Horn of Africa. Their bodies are literally engineered for exactly the conditions the Australian outback provides. They can survive on dry, fibrous vegetation that cattle would starve eating. Their kidneys concentrate urine far more efficiently than horses, meaning they can endure dehydration that would kill another animal twice their size. They can lose up to 30% of their body weight in water and fully recover by drinking once. And in the Australian desert, a landscape with limited large predators, nothing was stopping them. Dingoes, Australia's apex predator, occasionally took foals, but adult donkeys were a different matter entirely. A full-grown donkey will stand its ground against a dingo, turn towards the threat, and strike with both front hooves with enough force to kill. Dingoes learned quickly. The adult donkeys were, for all practical purposes, untouchable. By 1949, and this is where the story shifts from background noise to national alarm, the Western Australian government officially classified the feral donkey as a declared pest species. The number of wild donkeys in Australia at that point estimated at well over 100,000 animals. Some researchers believe the true figure was higher. Now, think about what 100,000 large, hard-hoofed animals do to a landscape that was never built to handle them. Because the destruction wasn't just about numbers, it was about the kind of damage they caused. And some of it was the kind of damage that doesn't repair itself in a human lifetime. Australia's desert ecology is ancient. The plants, the animals, the water systems, everything evolved together over tens of millions of years, completely isolated from large hoofed animals. There were no horses, no cattle, no deer in pre-European Australia. The land had no defence against them. And into that fragile, ancient system, feral donkeys walked in their hundreds of thousands. The damage began at the waterholes. In arid Australia, a permanent waterhole isn't just convenient, it's the difference between life and death for every living thing in a 50-kilometre radius. Insects, reptiles, birds, marsupials, every creature in the ecosystem is organised around those water points. When large herds of donkeys arrived at a waterhole, they arrived in force. Rangers in Western Australia's Kimberley region during the 1960s reported seeing herds of up to 300 animals gathered at a single water point. They churned the banks into mud. They contaminated the water. Smaller animals, the bilbies, the rock wallabies, the native birds, stopped coming. They couldn't compete. At the same time, the donkey's hooves were doing something invisible but catastrophic to the soil itself. Each step by a large hoofed animal compacts the soil beneath it, crushing the tiny air pockets that allow water to percolate downward after rain. Across thousands of square kilometres, feral donkeys were slowly turning the desert floor into something closer to concrete. Rain that should have soaked in was running off instead, carving erosion channels, stripping topsoil, and leaving behind landscapes that looked like the surface of Mars. We had a paddock that used to hold grass through to March, one Northern Territory pastoralist recalled in a 1974 agricultural report. 3 seasons after the donkeys moved through, it was bare red dirt by December. Fences were destroyed. Water tanks were damaged by crowding animals. Rare plant communities that had existed for thousands of years, desert spring vegetation, rockhole mosses, riparian shrubs, began disappearing from areas they had occupied since before European contact. The ecologists had a name for what was happening. They called it ecosystem engineering, when an invasive species alters the physical structure of the landscape itself, not just the species living in it. The feral donkey had become an engineer of destruction. This is where the story gets really interesting, because what Australia did next became a blueprint the rest of the world copied. Before we get there, if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. The next part of this story is something most people have never heard of. By the 1970s, the crisis could no longer be managed at the station level. The Australian government had to act on a national scale. The early control methods were blunt and limited. Station owners shot donkeys at waterholes. Traps were set along known travel routes. It barely registered. The population was too large and the land was too vast. Kill 500 animals in one location and the herds simply shifted 50 kilometres east. Then came the helicopters. Starting in the late 1970s and scaling up through the 1980s, the Australian government began organising large-scale aerial culling programs across the Northern Territory and Western Australia. Helicopters flew grid patterns across the desert, while trained marksmen targeted herds from above. It was expensive, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars per day in operational costs, but it was the only method that could reach the remote interior. In some regions, tens of thousands of animals were removed in a single campaign. But the most ingenious innovation came out of a field research program in the Northern Territory in the early 1980s. It was called the Judas donkey method. The concept was deceptively simple. Researchers would capture a wild donkey, fit it with a VHF radio tracking collar, and release it back into the landscape. Because donkeys are deeply social animals, they seek out other donkeys almost compulsively. The collared animal would naturally join the nearest herd. The trackers would then follow the signal, locate the entire group, and carry out a cull that removed dozens or sometimes hundreds of animals in a single operation, guided by one unwitting insider. The name came from the biblical figure, the betrayer who led others to their fate, and it worked. In trial regions, the Judas method dramatically accelerated the rate at which herds could be located and reduced. It was later adapted globally, for feral goats in the Galapagos Islands, for pigs in Hawaii, for horses in Nevada. Australia had accidentally pioneered one of the most powerful tools in invasive species management. By the late 1990s, in regions where sustained control programs had been carried out, donkey numbers had dropped by as much as 90% from their peak. Waterholes began recovering, vegetation showed signs of regrowth, pastoralists reported fewer fence breaches, cleaner water supplies, and healthier livestock. But here's what no one tells you about invasive species control. Reducing a population is not the same as solving the problem, because the moment the funding runs out, the moment the helicopters are grounded, the moment the political attention shifts, the animals come back. And they come back fast. Even as researchers fought to reduce donkey numbers, something strange was being noticed in the field. In parts of the Kimberley, during severe dry seasons, ecologists began documenting something they hadn't anticipated. Feral donkeys, searching for water in the dry season, were digging at dry creek beds with their hooves, sometimes going down 60 or 70 centimeters, until they struck subsurface moisture. These dugout depressions, which field researchers informally began calling donkey pits, sometimes created shallow water pools that persisted for weeks after the surrounding landscape had gone completely dry. And those pools were being used. Kangaroos, emus, galahs, even rare species of native frogs, reappearing in areas where they hadn't been documented for years. An invasive species, one simultaneously responsible for devastating native ecosystems, was also accidentally creating survival infrastructure for native wildlife in one of the driest places on Earth. The story of Australia's feral donkey, it turned out, didn't fit neatly into the category of pure villain. It was more complicated than that, more human in a way. Today, in 2025, feral donkeys remain present across millions of hectares of northern and central Australia. Their population, while significantly reduced from peak estimates of over 1 million animals in the 1980s, continues to fluctuate with rainfall patterns, funding cycles, and the sheer logistical difficulty of managing wildlife across one of the most remote landscapes on Earth. New tools are being tested. Satellite GPS collars now allow researchers to track herd movements in real time from offices in Darwin and Perth. Drone surveillance is being trialled in the Pilbara to map population densities without the cost of a helicopter fleet. Researchers at several Australian universities are actively studying the feasibility of fertility control, an injectable contraceptive that could slow breeding rates without culling, though delivering it at scale to animals spread across hundreds of thousands of square kilometres remains an almost impossibly complex logistical challenge. And the debate continues. For some Australians, particularly older residents of remote outback towns, the feral donkey carries something more than an ecological footnote. It carries memory. The sound of a braying donkey at dusk still echoes the era of the goldfields, the drovers, the frontier. To them, control programs feel like erasing something. To the conservationists, documenting the slow disappearance of native plant communities from ancient desert springs, the debate feels like luxury. Every season of inaction is another season of damage that may never fully reverse. Both are true. That's what makes this story extraordinary. Australia didn't just import a useful animal and lose control of it. It imported an animal, depended on it to build a civilization, discarded it when that civilization outgrew it, and then spent the next century paying the price of that decision, while simultaneously discovering that the price was more complicated, more layered, and more philosophically uncomfortable than anyone had bargained for. The donkey arrived as a saviour. It became a plague. And somewhere in between, it became a mirror, reflecting back every contradiction in how human beings relate to the natural world they think they control. So here's the question this story leaves behind. When we decide to bring something into a world it was never meant to be part of, whether it's an animal, an idea, or a system, do we ever truly understand what we're unleashing? Or do we only find out when it's already too late to undo it? Australia is still finding out. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to know, do you think Australia's approach to managing these animals has been right? Or is there a better way that nobody's talking about yet? And if this story hit differently than you expected, if it made you think about something bigger than just donkeys, then share it. Someone in your circle needs to see this. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next one.